The smallest act of kindness is often witnessed by the one person who can change your entire life. The cold October rain drummed against the sidewalks of downtown Boston, turning the evening rush into a blur of umbrellas, headlights, and hurried footsteps. People lowered their heads, clutching expensive coats tighter as they rushed toward warm apartments and waiting families, each convinced they had somewhere more important to be. Grace Walker had somewhere important to be too. Her 5-year-old daughter, Sophie, was waiting at Mrs. Henderson's apartment 3 blocks away, probably sitting by the window the way she always did whenever her mother worked the late shift at the diner. Grace checked the time on the cracked screen of her phone. 6:23. She was already 15 minutes late, and every extra minute meant another $1 she would owe the elderly neighbor who watched Sophie after school. She slipped the phone back into the pocket of her faded denim jacket and pulled the grocery bag closer against her chest. Inside were a loaf of discounted wheat bread, a gallon of milk, peanut butter, and Sophie's favorite apple slices, all carefully chosen to stretch until Friday's paycheck. The paper bag had grown soft from the rain, forcing Grace to cradle it carefully as she hurried down the crowded sidewalk. Her sneakers splashed through shallow puddles, cold water soaking through the worn soles, but she barely noticed anymore. This had become her life. Every dollar counted. Every minute mattered. Every decision carried consequences. She passed men in tailored suits speaking into wireless earbuds about investments worth more than she would earn in a lifetime. Young couples laughed beneath oversized umbrellas without noticing the exhausted waitress weaving quietly around them. A luxury SUV rolled past, sending a spray of water across the curb. No one apologized. No one slowed down. Grace simply stepped aside and kept walking. Then she saw her. An elderly woman stood near the edge of a crosswalk, one hand resting against a bus stop bench. Her silver hair clung to her face, damp from the rain, while a small canvas shopping bag lay tipped over beside her, oranges rolling across the wet sidewalk. People streamed around her as though she were part of the scenery. One businessman glanced briefly in her direction before checking his watch. A teenager stepped around the scattered fruit without breaking stride. A rideshare driver pulled away from the curb before the woman could reach the door. Grace slowed instinctively. She looked toward the next intersection, calculating the extra minutes. Sophie would still be waiting. Mrs. Henderson would probably sigh the way she always did when Grace arrived late. The overdue electric bill was sitting unopened on her kitchen table. Her manager had warned her that another missed shift or late arrival could cost her the job. Every logical thought told her to keep walking. The rain grew heavier. The old woman reached for one of the rolling oranges, but her balance faltered, forcing her to grip the bench more tightly as the grocery bag slipped farther into the puddle. Grace closed her eyes for only a second. Then she turned around. Setting her own groceries beneath the bus shelter, she hurried toward the stranger with a gentle smile that reached her tired blue eyes. "Ma'am," she said softly, careful not to startle her. "Please don't worry about these. I've got them." She knelt on the soaked pavement, gathering each orange one by one before wiping them dry with the sleeve of her jacket. The elderly woman watched silently, surprise replacing the uncertainty in her expression. "You're getting yourself soaked," the woman finally whispered. Grace smiled without looking up. "Rain dries," she replied. People shouldn't have to stand alone. Neither of them noticed the black sedan parked quietly across the street. Behind its rain-speckled window, a middle-aged driver lowered his phone after taking a discreet photograph, while the distinguished woman seated in the back watched every small gesture with thoughtful eyes that revealed nothing. For the first time in many years, Margaret Sinclair found herself staring not at another billionaire, another politician, or another corporate titan, but at a young single mother who had just chosen compassion over convenience without realizing the entire course of her life had begun to change. Grace carefully placed the last orange back into the canvas bag before standing and offering her hand. The elderly woman hesitated only for a moment before accepting it, her fingers surprisingly cold despite the wool gloves she wore. Up close, Grace noticed the woman was elegantly dressed beneath a simple beige raincoat that concealed the quality of the tailored clothes underneath. There was nothing flashy about her appearance, yet something about the quiet confidence in her posture suggested a lifetime of dignity. "Thank you," the woman said with a gentle smile. "Most people cannot afford to lose a minute these days." Grace glanced toward the busy street where strangers continued rushing past without slowing. Maybe that is exactly why we should spare one when someone needs it. The woman studied her face with quiet curiosity, as though searching for something beyond the words themselves. "What is your name?" she asked. Grace shook her head with an apologetic smile while lifting the soaked grocery bag from the sidewalk. "Grace. Just Grace." The woman introduced herself simply as Margaret, leaving out every title and accomplishment that had made her one of the most influential women in the country. "I was trying to catch my driver," Margaret explained. "Apparently, I was a little too stubborn to wait inside." Grace laughed softly. "My grandmother used to say stubborn people live the longest because they refuse to let life tell them what to do." Margaret laughed for the first time that day, the warm sound almost lost beneath the steady ring. "Your grandmother sounds like a remarkable woman." Grace's smile faded just enough to reveal an old sadness. She raised me after my parents passed away. She taught me that kindness costs less than regret." Before Margaret could respond, a quiet cough escaped her lips, followed by a slight sway that immediately caught Grace's attention. "Are you feeling all right?" Grace asked, her expression turning serious. "I am only a little dizzy," Margaret admitted. "It will pass." Grace gently reached for her wrist. "Please sit down for a minute." Margaret allowed herself to be guided onto the nearby bench without protest. Grace knelt beside her, concern replacing the gentle smile she had worn moments earlier. She touched Margaret's forehead with the back of her hand, the way she always checked Sophie whenever she felt unwell. "You feel colder than you should." Margaret seemed almost amused by the unexpected care. "You have done enough already." "Not yet," Grace replied quietly. She reached into her grocery bag and removed the unopened gallon of milk, setting it aside before pulling out the small fleece blanket she always carried for Sophie during chilly evenings. Without hesitation, she wrapped it carefully around Margaret's shoulders. "Your daughter will miss that blanket," Margaret observed. Grace looked down at the colorful fabric covered with tiny cartoon stars and smiled. "She would probably tell me I did the right thing." Margaret lowered her eyes, visibly moved. Very few people knew that the richest woman in America had spent decades wondering whether genuine kindness still existed beyond carefully staged charity events and polished speeches. Yet here sat a young waitress who could barely afford groceries, giving away the one warm blanket meant for her own child without expecting anything in return. Across the street, the black sedan remained parked beneath the gray sky. Daniel Brooks watched quietly from the passenger seat, waiting for instructions that never came. Margaret had ordered everyone to remain where they were unless absolutely necessary. She wanted to see the young woman exactly as she was, untouched by influence or recognition. A few minutes later, another wave of dizziness washed over Margaret, causing her breathing to become noticeably uneven. Grace immediately stood and raised her hand toward an approaching taxi. When it stopped, she opened the rear door before turning back toward Margaret with calm determination. "You are coming with me to the hospital." Margaret gently protested. "That is not necessary." Grace offered the same patient smile she used whenever Sophie insisted she did not need medicine. "Maybe not, but I would rather lose an hour today than spend the rest of my life wondering if I should have helped when I had the chance." Margaret looked into Grace's tired blue eyes and, for reasons she could not explain, felt something she had not experienced in many years: complete trust. The emergency room was quieter than Grace expected, filled with the steady hum of fluorescent lights, distant conversations, and the occasional rolling sound of hospital carts moving through polished hallways. She remained beside Margaret while a nurse completed a routine examination, answering simple questions whenever the older woman paused to catch her breath. The physician smiled reassuringly after reviewing the test results. "Fortunately, it appears to be mild exhaustion combined with dehydration. Nothing serious, but you should avoid walking alone in weather like this for a while." Grace finally allowed herself to breathe easier. Margaret thanked the medical staff with sincere warmth before turning toward Grace. "You have already given me far more of your evening than I deserve." Grace glanced at the clock hanging above the nurse's station. It was almost 8 o'clock. Sophie had certainly finished dinner by now, and Mrs. Henderson was probably telling her another bedtime story while wondering whether Grace had been delayed by work again. Even so, she smiled gently. "You deserved exactly what anyone else would deserve." Margaret slowly reached into her handbag and removed an elegant leather wallet. Please let me repay you for everything. The taxi, the hospital visit, your groceries, your time. Grace immediately shook her head. No, thank you. Margaret looked surprised. At least allow me to replace your daughter's blanket. Grace looked toward the colorful fleece still resting across Margaret's shoulders and smiled with quiet affection. Keep it until you get home. Sophie has another one. It was only partly true. The second blanket was much thinner, but Sophie had never complained about such things. Margaret carefully folded the blanket across her lap, studying the young woman with growing admiration. You are making it very difficult for me to thank you. Grace laughed softly. Then maybe you already have. Before Margaret could ask what she meant, Grace continued. My grandmother always believed gratitude should travel forward instead of backward. If someone helps you today, help someone else tomorrow. That way kindness keeps moving. The words settled quietly between them. Margaret had spent decades listening to polished speeches from world leaders, celebrated entrepreneurs, and respected philanthropists. Yet somehow this exhausted single mother had expressed something far more meaningful in a single sentence. Moments later, a tall man in a dark overcoat entered the waiting area with measured urgency. His silver hair was neatly combed despite the rain, and his composed expression softened with visible relief the moment he saw Margaret sitting comfortably. Mrs. Sinclair, he said respectfully before stopping himself. Margaret offered him a subtle glance that immediately reminded him of her earlier instructions. Margaret, she corrected with a warm smile. This is my attorney, Daniel. Daniel Brooks quickly understood. He turned toward Grace and extended his hand. Thank you for helping my friend. We were very worried when we lost contact with her. Grace shook his hand politely. She is going to be all right. That is what matters. Daniel discreetly noticed the damp jacket, the inexpensive shoes still soaked from the rain, and the grocery bag resting beside her chair. Nothing about her appearance suggested someone looking for recognition or reward. Margaret slowly stood, leaning lightly on her umbrella. Before leaving, she looked directly into Grace's eyes. Will I ever see you again? Grace adjusted the strap of her worn handbag and smiled with quiet sincerity. If life wants us to. With that, she picked up her groceries and hurried toward the hospital exit, completely unaware that Daniel had already memorized her name from the patient registration form she had completed on Margaret's behalf. The automatic doors closed behind Grace as the cold evening air welcomed her back into the city. She rushed toward the nearest subway station, thinking only about Sophie and the bedtime story she had already missed. Inside the hospital lobby, Margaret remained perfectly still, watching the rain through the glass entrance until Grace disappeared into the crowd. Only then did she turn toward Daniel. Her gentle expression transformed into one of calm authority that had shaped industries and influenced presidents for more than 40 years. Find out everything about Grace Walker, she said quietly. Not because I doubt her character, but because I have not met a soul like hers in a very long time. Daniel nodded respectfully. I will begin immediately. Margaret held Sophie's little blanket a little closer before speaking one final sentence that Daniel would never forget. Tonight, the wealthiest woman in America received a gift that money has never been able to buy. Now I intend to discover who taught that young woman to become so wonderfully rich. 3 days later, the first rays of morning sunlight reflected across the glass towers of Sinclair Global, bathing the executive boardroom in warm gold as Margaret Sinclair sat quietly at the head of the polished walnut table. A thick folder rested before her, untouched for several minutes. Around her, senior executives waited patiently, accustomed to her thoughtful silences. Daniel Brooks finally stepped forward and placed another document beside the first. Everything you requested is here, he said respectfully. Margaret opened the folder with careful hands. There were employment records from the neighborhood diner, rental agreements, medical bills, school enrollment forms, and dozens of background reports. Yet what caught her attention first was not a financial statement, but a photograph. Grace stood outside a small elementary school holding Sophie's hand, both of them laughing over something invisible beyond the camera. Neither wore expensive clothes. Neither appeared concerned about what they lacked. Margaret studied the picture for a long moment before continuing. Grace worked 6 days each week, often accepting double shifts whenever another waitress called in sick. Every Tuesday evening, she volunteered at the community food pantry despite having little herself. Twice each month, she visited a retirement home simply to read books to residents whose families rarely came. She had never accepted public assistance she did not qualify for. She had no criminal record, no lawsuits, no outstanding debts beyond ordinary medical expenses, and no history of asking wealthy people for favors. Daniel quietly added another report. We interviewed nearly everyone who knows her without revealing your interest. The answers were remarkably consistent. Margaret raised her eyes. Tell me. Daniel smiled faintly. They all described the same woman. Honest, dependable, patient. The kind of person who remembers birthdays but forgets her own. The kind who brings homemade soup when someone is sick even if she has worked 12 hours. Margaret closed the folder slowly. Does anyone dislike her? Daniel almost laughed. Only one former landlord who complained that she always paid rent 2 or 3 days late after her husband left. Even he admitted she eventually paid every dollar. Margaret looked through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Boston skyline. Thousands of people hurried through the streets below, each carrying invisible stories. How old is Sophie now? 5 years old, Daniel replied. Her teachers describe her as polite, curious, and unusually generous with other children. Margaret nodded quietly. Children rarely invent kindness on their own. Several hundred miles away, another meeting was beginning inside Carter Holdings. Ethan Carter stood before a digital presentation while senior executives reviewed quarterly reports projected across the conference room wall. At 37, he had built one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the country through discipline, intelligence, and relentless focus. Investors admired him. Competitors respected him. Employees considered him fair but emotionally distant. He listened carefully as department heads discussed expansion plans worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet his attention briefly shifted when his assistant entered carrying a handwritten note. This came from Mrs. Sinclair's office, she whispered. Ethan opened the folded card. Dinner tomorrow evening. 8 o'clock. Please come alone. The message contained no explanation, only Margaret's elegant signature beneath it. Ethan smiled despite himself. Since losing his parents years earlier, Margaret had quietly become the closest thing he had to family. She had mentored him long before he became a successful chief executive officer, never allowing wealth to replace wisdom. Whenever she requested his presence, he never refused. Back inside Sinclair Global, Margaret remained standing beside the enormous windows, watching clouds drift above the city with thoughtful calm. Daniel approached once more. May I ask what you are planning? Margaret answered without turning around. For 40 years I have invested in companies because I believed character determines the future more than talent. She paused before continuing. This week I discovered someone whose character is extraordinary. Daniel waited patiently. Margaret finally faced him with the quiet certainty that had built an empire. Tomorrow evening I will invite Ethan to dinner. Daniel looked slightly puzzled. To discuss Grace? Margaret smiled knowingly. No. To begin changing two lives that have never met, yet somehow already belong in the same story. The following afternoon, Grace was balancing a tray of coffee cups through the crowded diner when her manager waved her toward the front counter. Grace, there is someone asking for you. She frowned with quiet confusion. Customers rarely asked for her by name. Wiping her hands on her apron, she stepped into the lobby and found a well-dressed man standing patiently beside the entrance. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, yet his expression carried none of the arrogance she had learned to expect from wealthy strangers. It took her only a second to recognize him. Daniel? She asked carefully. He smiled. I was hoping you would remember me. Grace returned the smile. How is Margaret? I have wondered about her. She is doing very well, Daniel replied. In fact, she asked me to deliver a message personally. He handed her a cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax. Grace opened it slowly, revealing a handwritten note in elegant cursive. Dear Grace, I owe you far more than thanks. Would you honor me by joining me for dinner tomorrow evening? There is something I would very much like to discuss. Warmly, Margaret. Grace read the note twice before looking up. This is very kind, but I do not think I belong at fancy dinners. Daniel smiled knowingly. Mrs. Sinclair specifically asked me to tell you that she is inviting the woman who helped her, not the clothes she wears. Grace laughed softly despite herself. She really said that? Word for word. She looked toward the dining room, where customers continued talking over lunch, while coffee machines hissed in the background. I cannot afford a babysitter tomorrow. Daniel reached into his briefcase and produced another envelope. Mrs. Henderson has already been contacted and happily agreed to watch Sophie at no cost. Mrs. Sinclair insisted that every obstacle be removed before you could invent one yourself. Grace lowered her eyes with quiet embarrassment. No one had gone to such trouble for her in years. Please tell Margaret I will come. The following evening, the setting sun painted the sky with soft shades of orange as Grace stood outside the gates of the Sinclair estate, wearing the only dress she owned for special occasions. It was simple, navy blue, carefully pressed, and several years old, yet she had stitched every loose thread herself until it looked almost new. Sophie had hugged her tightly before she left and whispered, "Grandma always said pretty hearts make pretty people." Grace carried those words with her as she walked toward the front entrance. The mansion itself seemed almost unreal. White stone columns framed towering windows that reflected the fading light, while perfectly trimmed gardens stretched across acres of peaceful silence. Instead of feeling impressed, Grace felt slightly out of place. She quietly reminded herself that people were simply people, no matter how large their homes might be. The front door opened before she could knock. Linda Hayes, the longtime house manager, welcomed her with genuine warmth. "Mrs. Sinclair has been looking forward to seeing you all day." Grace stepped inside, trying not to stare at the grand staircase or the sparkling crystal chandelier overhead. Everything felt elegant without being excessive, as though comfort had always mattered more than showing wealth. In another wing of the estate, Ethan Carter handed his car keys to the valet before entering through the same front doors. He greeted Linda with familiar affection. "Good evening. Is Margaret already in the dining room?" Linda smiled in a way that immediately caught his attention. "She is waiting, but tonight you are not her only guest." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Business. You will have to ask her." Curious, he followed Linda through the quiet hallway until they reached the library. At that exact moment, Grace was being escorted from the opposite direction. Both turned the corner simultaneously. They stopped several feet apart, equally surprised by the unexpected encounter. Grace saw a tall man in a perfectly fitted dark suit, whose calm blue eyes carried intelligence rather than pride. Ethan saw a woman whose simple dress could not hide the quiet grace with which she carried herself. Neither spoke for a brief moment. Before either could introduce themselves, Margaret's warm voice echoed from the open doorway ahead. "Wonderful," she said with unmistakable satisfaction. "The two people I most wanted to see have finally arrived." Grace instinctively offered her hand first. "I am Grace Walker." Ethan accepted the handshake with a courteous smile. "Ethan Carter. It is nice to meet you." His voice was calm and measured, carrying none of the self-importance Grace had expected from someone who clearly belonged in a place like this. Before either of them could continue, Margaret stepped forward with unmistakable delight shining in her eyes. "Now that introductions are over, let us enjoy dinner before we discuss why I invited both of you." The dining room overlooked a quiet garden where soft lanterns illuminated stone pathways winding through autumn flowers. Unlike the enormous banquet table Grace had imagined, Margaret had chosen a small round table set for three. Candlelight reflected gently against crystal glasses, creating an atmosphere that felt surprisingly intimate rather than formal. Throughout the meal, Margaret guided the conversation with effortless warmth. She asked Grace about Sophie, smiling as Grace described her daughter's endless curiosity and habit of asking impossible questions before bedtime. Ethan listened quietly, occasionally laughing whenever Grace shared another innocent story about Sophie's imagination. In return, Margaret asked Ethan about Carter Holdings and the charitable education programs his company had recently funded. Grace was surprised to discover that the reserved man sitting across from her was the chief executive officer she had occasionally seen featured in business magazines near the grocery store checkout line. Yet he spoke about his success with remarkable humility, giving far more credit to his employees than to himself. As dessert arrived, Margaret rested her teacup on its saucer and looked at both of them with unusual seriousness. The comfortable conversation slowly faded into silence. "There is a reason I asked the two of you here tonight." Ethan leaned back slightly, recognizing the expression Margaret wore whenever she was about to reveal an important decision. Grace folded her hands quietly in her lap, uncertain what to expect. Margaret looked first toward Grace. 3 evenings ago, You chose to help an elderly stranger standing alone in the rain. You gave away your daughter's blanket, refused my money, and lost valuable hours without expecting anything in return. Grace lowered her eyes modestly. Anyone should have done the same. Margaret gently shook her head. Many people could have. Very few actually did. She then turned toward Ethan. For years I have admired your intelligence, your discipline, and your integrity. You have built an extraordinary company, but there remains something life has never truly taught you. Ethan smiled faintly. That sounds concerning. Margaret smiled in return. Compassion cannot be learned from balance sheets or board meetings. Ethan's expression softened. He respected Margaret enough to listen without interrupting. She folded her hands together before speaking words that neither of them could have anticipated. I want the two of you to marry. The room became completely still. Even the quiet ticking of the antique grandfather clock suddenly seemed louder. Grace stared at Margaret in disbelief, certain she had misunderstood. Ethan blinked once before slowly setting down his fork. Several silent seconds passed before Grace finally found her voice. Margaret, I am sorry. Did you say marry? Margaret nodded with complete composure. Ethan released a quiet breath, searching Margaret's face for any sign that she might be joking. There was none. You cannot possibly be serious, he said gently. Entirely serious. Grace shook her head almost immediately. I barely know Mr. Carter. Ethan gave a polite nod. And while I respect Miss Walker very much already, marriage is not something either of us should ever treat lightly. Margaret looked at them with remarkable calm. Exactly. That is why I chose both of you. Grace looked completely bewildered. I do not understand. Margaret's eyes filled with quiet wisdom shaped by decades of observing human nature. I am not asking you to marry because of romance. Romance often arrives later if character comes first. I am asking because one of you has spent a lifetime giving love without receiving enough in return, while the other has spent a lifetime earning success without allowing enough love inside. Ethan remained silent, absorbing every word. Grace felt her heartbeat quicken with confusion. Margaret smiled gently at them both. Sometimes destiny does not begin with two people falling in love. Sometimes it begins when someone wise enough recognizes that two lonely hearts have been walking toward each other long before they ever meet. Grace was the first to recover from the silence. She looked at Margaret with gratitude, but also with quiet determination. You honored me by inviting me into your home, and I will always be thankful for your kindness. But marriage is a promise, not a favor. I cannot say yes simply because someone asks me to. Ethan nodded immediately. I agree with her. Margaret did not appear disappointed. Instead, she smiled gently, as though their response confirmed something she had already suspected. I expected both of you to answer exactly that way. Ethan leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. Then why ask? Margaret slowly stood and walked toward the fireplace, where an old framed photograph rested beside a collection of family pictures. She picked it up carefully before returning to the table. The faded photograph showed a much younger Margaret standing beside a smiling man beneath an oak tree. They looked happy in a way that wealth could never manufacture. My husband chose me when I had nothing, she said softly. Everyone believed he was making the biggest mistake of his life. They said I came from the wrong neighborhood, the wrong family, the wrong world. Her fingers gently brushed the edge of the photograph. 48 years later, people called us the greatest partnership they had ever seen. Grace listened quietly, while Ethan lowered his eyes with thoughtful respect. Margaret placed the photograph back onto the table. Do you know what made our marriage work? Neither answered. It was never money. It was never status. We simply admired the person sitting across from us every single day. She turned toward Ethan. You have spent years building companies that improve lives, but your own life has become painfully predictable. Every meeting is scheduled. Every decision is calculated. Every relationship is measured. Ethan offered a faint smile. That is not entirely unfair. Margaret then faced Grace. And you have spent years sacrificing everything for everyone else. You have forgotten that your own happiness deserves a place beside your daughter's. Grace looked down at her folded hands without speaking. Margaret's voice remained calm. I am not asking either of you to pretend to be in love tomorrow morning. She paused before continuing. I am asking whether you are willing to give life the opportunity to surprise you. Ethan considered her words for several moments before speaking. Suppose we agreed to spend time getting to know each other instead. without expectations, without promises we cannot honestly make. Grace looked toward him, slightly surprised by the suggestion. Ethan continued respectfully. Marriage deserves sincerity, but friendship can begin with honesty. Margaret's smile grew warmer. That is a far wiser answer than either of you realizes. Daniel quietly entered the dining room carrying a thin folder. Margaret accepted it and slid it toward Ethan without opening it. This is not a contract. Ethan glanced at the folder curiously. Then what is it? A proposal. Grace looked equally puzzled. Margaret explained, for the next 90 days, I would like the two of you to participate in a charitable initiative through the Sinclair Foundation. Ethan, your company has already partnered with several community organizations. Grace, your experience serving ordinary families gives you a perspective executives rarely possess. I want both of you to work together. Ethan slowly nodded. A real project. A meaningful one, Margaret replied. Grace hesitated. I still have my job at the diner. Margaret smiled. The foundation will compensate you fairly for your time. No gifts. No charity. Honest work for honest pay. Grace immediately relaxed. That mattered to her more than Margaret could possibly know. Ethan turned toward Grace with a respectful expression. If you are willing, I think we could help a lot of people. Grace met his eyes for the first time since dinner began. She saw no pressure, no pride, and no hidden agenda. Only quiet sincerity. After a thoughtful pause, she smiled gently. Then let us help people. Margaret leaned back in her chair, hiding the satisfaction that quietly filled her heart. She had not brought two strangers together to force destiny. She had simply opened a door. Whether they walked through it would now depend entirely on the choices they made together, one ordinary day at a time. The 90 days began with paperwork, planning meetings, and schedules that looked impossible to reconcile. Grace still worked evening shifts at the diner, while Ethan balanced board meetings, investor calls, and international conferences. Yet every Wednesday morning, they visited neighborhoods where the Sinclair Foundation planned to expand its family support programs. Instead of arriving with television cameras or prepared speeches, they listened. They met exhausted parents trying to stretch grocery budgets through the end of the month, grandparents raising grandchildren on fixed incomes, and children whose biggest wish was simply a safe place to study after school. Grace spoke with every family as though they were old friends. She remembered names after meeting someone only once. She knelt beside children instead of talking down to them. She noticed empty refrigerators before reading financial reports. Ethan quietly watched her, realizing she gathered more truth in 10 minutes of conversation than most consultants uncovered in months of expensive research. One afternoon, they visited a community center preparing weekend meal packages. Volunteers formed an assembly line, filling paper bags with canned vegetables, pasta, cereal, and fresh fruit. Grace immediately tied on an apron and joined them without waiting for instructions. Ethan rolled up the sleeves of his dress shirt and followed. At first, the volunteers seemed nervous working beside the well-known chief executive officer, but Grace laughed easily whenever Ethan accidentally packed 3 boxes of cereal into one bag or struggled to fold cardboard cartons properly. Before long, everyone else was laughing too. The room no longer felt divided between executives and volunteers. It simply felt like neighbors helping neighbors. During the drive back to the city, Ethan looked out the passenger window while rain tapped softly against the windshield. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Grace smiled. "You already are." He laughed quietly before continuing. "How do you stay positive after everything life has handed you?" Grace considered the question for several moments. "I do not always stay positive." She looked toward the passing trees outside. "Some nights I cry after Sophie falls asleep because I am tired or scared or unsure how I will pay another bill." Ethan remained silent, listening carefully. "But every morning she wakes up believing the world is still full of good people. I have decided not to prove her wrong." Those words stayed with Ethan long after he dropped Grace home that evening. The next morning, he walked through Carter Holdings with different eyes. He noticed the overnight cleaning crew finishing their shifts before sunrise. For the first time in years, he stopped to introduce himself to employees whose names had never appeared on executive reports. He asked the cafeteria workers what could improve their jobs. He visited the customer service department without cameras or assistants, spending an hour answering calls beside new employees simply to understand the challenges they faced. The changes spread quietly through the company. Flexible work schedules were introduced for parents with young children. Emergency childcare assistance became available for employees facing unexpected family situations. Scholarships were expanded for workers pursuing evening classes. None of the announcements mentioned Grace, yet every decision carried the influence of conversations Ethan had shared with her over those weeks. Margaret watched these developments with quiet satisfaction. During one foundation meeting, she invited Daniel to stand beside the conference room window overlooking the city. "Do you see it?" she asked softly. Daniel smiled. "He is changing." Margaret nodded. Not because someone ordered him to, because someone inspired him to. Across town, Grace experienced changes of her own. Working beside Ethan had slowly challenged assumptions she had carried for years. She had believed every wealthy executive placed profits above people, yet Ethan consistently remembered the names of children they met, personally visited completed projects without seeking recognition, and always thanked every volunteer before leaving an event. One Saturday afternoon, Sophie tugged gently on Grace's sleeve while watching Ethan help a little boy assemble a donated bicycle. "Mom," she whispered with complete innocence, "Mr. Ethan smiles more now than when we first met him." Grace looked across the playground and realized her daughter was right. Then Sophie asked another question that made Grace's heart pause. "Do you think sometimes people are lonely even when everybody knows their name?" Grace looked at Ethan laughing with the children beneath the warm autumn sun and quietly answered, "Yes, sweetheart. Sometimes those are the loneliest people of all." 90 days passed more quickly than any of them expected. On a crisp Saturday afternoon, the Sinclair Foundation welcomed hundreds of families to celebrate the opening of its largest community resource center, a place offering childcare assistance, job training, educational programs, and affordable meals for families who simply needed someone to believe in them. Children raced across the playground with bright laughter, while volunteers planted flowers along the sidewalks. Grace stood near the entrance, watching Sophie proudly hand out welcome bags to younger children with the same cheerful smile that had always made difficult days seem a little lighter. Across the courtyard, Ethan greeted employees, volunteers, and neighborhood residents not as honored guests, but as partners who had built something meaningful together. Margaret observed everything from a nearby garden bench, her silver hair glowing softly beneath the afternoon sunlight. Daniel quietly approached with 2 cups of tea. "You were right," he said with a satisfied smile. Margaret accepted the cup without taking her eyes off Grace and Ethan. "No," she replied gently. "They were." As the celebration slowly came to an end, Margaret asked Grace and Ethan to join her beneath a large oak tree overlooking the playground. The same tree had become the centerpiece of the new community center, chosen because its wide branches offered shade and comfort to everyone who gathered beneath it. Sophie chased Bubbles nearby with several new friends, completely unaware that another important conversation was about to begin. Margaret smiled warmly at both of them. 3 months ago, I believed I needed to arrange your future." Grace and Ethan exchanged curious glances. Margaret continued, her voice calm and sincere. "I was wrong." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "Wrong?" Margaret nodded. "I thought 2 good people needed someone else to guide them toward happiness. Instead, the 2 of you discovered it yourselves by serving others." She reached into her handbag and removed a folded document before tearing it gently in half. Grace looked surprised. "What was that?" Margaret smiled. "The proposal I asked Daniel to prepare in case either of you felt obligated to continue this journey for my sake." She let the torn pages fall into a nearby recycling container. "As of this moment, neither of you owes me another minute." Silence settled comfortably beneath the old oak tree. Grace slowly looked toward Ethan. "I suppose this is goodbye to our Wednesday meetings." Ethan smiled, but there was an unmistakable sadness behind it. "I was hoping we might find another reason to keep meeting." Grace felt her heart race in a way it never had before. There were no grand ballrooms, no expensive gifts, and no dramatic promises. Only honesty. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully removed a small velvet box. Grace's eyes widened in surprise. Margaret quietly stood and walked several steps away, giving them the privacy they deserved. Ethan took a slow breath before speaking. 3 months ago, I believed success meant solving problems. Then I met someone who quietly solved them by loving people instead. His voice remained steady, yet deeply sincere. "Grace," I do not know what the future will bring. I only know that every day I spend beside you makes me want to become a better man than I was the day before." He opened the box to reveal a simple diamond ring that reflected the afternoon sunlight without extravagance. "This time I am not asking because someone else believed we belonged together. I am asking because I do." Tears filled Grace's eyes as she looked towards Sophie laughing beneath the autumn sky. She remembered every lonely evening, every unpaid bill, every moment she had wondered whether kindness still mattered in a world that often hurried past those in need. Then she looked back at Ethan, whose life had changed just as profoundly as her own. She smiled through happy tears and quietly whispered, "Yes." Sophie noticed the embrace first and ran toward them as fast as her little legs could carry her. "Does this mean Mr. Ethan gets to stay with us?" she asked with innocent excitement. Ethan laughed warmly before kneeling to her height. "Only if you think that is a good idea." Sophie wrapped both small arms around his neck. "I have thought it was a good idea for a long time." Margaret watched the three of them standing together beneath the old oak tree and softly closed her eyes with peaceful gratitude. She had spent a lifetime believing wealth could change the world, but that rainy evening had reminded her of a greater truth. Money could build houses, businesses, and foundations, but only kindness could build a home inside another human heart. And once that home was built, its doors could remain open forever.